The year was 1879, and the wind in Red Hollow had teeth. It was a salt wind, a scavenger that blew in from the great western flats, carrying the grit of a dead sea. It scoured the land, peeled paint from the signpost marking the turnoff to the Merrick Ranch, and worried the loose shingles on the barn roof until they hummed a low, mournful tune. The dust didn't just rise, it was pulled into long, smoky ribbons that trailed across the valley floor, erasing the horizon and blurring the line between earth and sky. It was a mean, thirsty country, and the wind was its voice. Cole Merrick felt it on the back of his neck, a familiar prickle of sand and sweat. He rode with his hat pulled low, his shoulders hunched against the ceaseless push. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Gideon, moved with the steady, ground-eating gait of an animal that knew its work. The last of the spring calves, their coats the color of dried corn husks, bawled nervously ahead of him, their small bodies buffeted by the gusts. He was pushing them toward the relative shelter of the home pasture, a day-long task that had started before the sun had crested the eastern ridges. The squeak and groan of his saddle was a constant companion, a sound so ingrained in his life it was like a second heartbeat. Leather rubbed against leather, worn smooth in some places, cracked and dry in others. It smelled of horse, sweat, and oil, the scent of his solitude. With every shift of his weight, the old scar on the inside of his left wrist pulled tight. It was a pale, ragged line, a souvenir from a branding iron and a spooked colt years ago. In this dry, biting wind, it always seemed to burn, a dull ache that reminded him of the 100 other small pains that made up a rancher's life. He rubbed it absently with his thumb, his gaze sweeping the parched landscape. There was nothing but rock, sagebrush, and the endless, aching sky. And the wind, always the wind. It was the wind that carried the sound to him, first a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, but heavier, deader. It was followed by a splintering groan. Cole reined Gideon in, his head cocked. The calves milled about, confused by the halt. He listened past their bleating, past the whistle of the wind through a knot of juniper trees. There it was again, the angry splintering of wood under strain. It came from the direction of the old wagon road, a treacherous slope of rock and sun-hardened clay that cut down into the valley. He nudged Gideon forward, urging the calves into a quicker trot. Trouble on that road was a common thing, but the sound was not. As he cleared a rise, he saw it, a heavy freight wagon. Its canvas cover, bleached and torn, was canted at a dangerous angle on the steepest part of the grade. One of the rear wheels had shattered, the spokes splayed out like broken teeth. The axle was dug deep into the unforgiving earth, anchoring the whole rig in a posture of defeat. The two draft horses stood with their heads low, their flanks heaving, their harness lines slack. And then he saw her. She was not with the horses. She was beside the broken wheel, her back to him. A woman, young by the set of her shoulders, dressed in a coarse-spun man's shirt. The sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her trousers were tucked into muddy, scuffed boots that looked like they had walked 1,000 miles. She was braced against the wagon, her entire body straining. In her hands was a thick piece of timber she was trying to force under the axle as a lever. Cole watched for a long moment, a silent observer hidden by the shimmering heat. She wasn't calling for help. She wasn't wringing her hands or looking desperately up and down the empty road. She was working. He could see the muscles in her forearms bunch and tighten, the strain travel up her shoulders to her neck. She set her feet, took a deep breath that pulled the rough fabric of her shirt taut across her back, and heaved. The timber scraped against the axle, but the wagon didn't budge. She let out a frustrated sound, a growl more than a cry, and kicked at a loose rock. Then she bent again, repositioning the timber, her focus absolute. Her dark hair was tied back in a simple knot, but strands had escaped to whip across her face in the wind. She paid them no mind. Her world had shrunk to the broken wheel, the stubborn axle, and the unyielding weight of her predicament. Cole nudged Gideon into a slow walk, circling around the rise to approach from below. He didn't want to startle her or the horses. As he drew closer, he saw her face for the first time. It was smudged with dirt and sweat, her jaw set in a line of pure, unadulterated stubbornness. Her eyes, when she finally sensed his presence and glanced up, were the color of dark, wet stone, and they held a fierce, defiant light. They took him in the tired horse, the dusty clothes, the scar on his wrist, and dismissed him in the same instant, returning their full attention to the task. She did not want his help. Her posture, her gaze, the very air around her screamed it. He dismounted slowly, the creak of his saddle leather loud in the sudden lull of the wind. He left Gideon to stand, ground-reined and patient. "That's a tough angle," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, gritty as the dust under his boots. She didn't look up. She grunted, shoving the timber wedge with her entire body. "I'm aware of the angle." He walked closer, his boots crunching on the gravelly soil. He could smell the sweat of her effort, the scent of hot wood and frustration. "You'll throw your back out before you move it an inch that way. The axle's buried too deep." She finally straightened, wiping a forearm across her brow, leaving a muddy streak. She glared at him, her dark eyes flashing. "And I suppose you have a better idea?" Cole ignored the challenge in her tone. He looked at the shattered wheel, the deep rut, the precarious tilt of the wagon bed. He pointed with his chin. "You need to lift, not just lever. Lift the axle straight up, just enough to get a block under it. Then you can work on the wheel." "I don't have a block that will hold," she snapped, her patience clearly worn thinner than the soles of her boots. "And I don't have 3 arms," he nodded, as if she'd just stated a simple fact of agriculture, like rain makes mud. He moved to the back of the wagon, planting his feet wide. He bent his knees, getting his body low, and slid his shoulder under the corner of the heavy wooden bed, right over the axle. The wood was hot from the sun, rough against the fabric of his shirt. "Get your wedge ready," he said, his voice a low rumble. "When I lift, you shove it under the axle." She stared at him, her mouth a thin line of disbelief. Then a flicker of something else, annoyance. Maybe, or resentment. "I didn't ask for your help." Cole settled his weight, preparing to lift. "No, ma'am, you did not." He braced himself, took a breath, and pushed up with his legs. For a moment, nothing happened. The wagon was a dead weight, an anchor chained to the center of the earth. He could feel the strain shoot through his thighs, up his spine, into his shoulders. The old scar on his wrist screamed in protest. He gritted his teeth and drove harder, a low groan escaping his lips. Slowly, agonizingly, the wagon began to shift. The wood groaned, the frame creaking as it fought against gravity. He felt the axle lift, a fraction of an inch, then another. "Now!" he grunted, the word forced out from between clenched teeth. The woman, Eliza Hart, though he wouldn't know her name for another hour, reacted instantly. There was no hesitation. She slammed the timber wedge into the space he'd created. It seated with a solid thud. "More!" she commanded, her voice sharp. He pushed again, every muscle in his body screaming. He lifted it another inch, and she hammered the wedge in deeper with a rock she'd had ready at her feet. "All right," she said. "Hold it." He held, his body trembling with the effort, sweat dripping into his eyes, blurring the harsh landscape. He could feel the weight of the whole world on his shoulder. He watched as she scrambled to the other side, finding another piece of shattered spoke and wedging it under the frame. She worked with a fierce, efficient economy of motion. There was no wasted energy, no doubt in her actions. She knew exactly what she was doing. "Let it down," she said, her voice tight with exertion. "Easy." He lowered the wagon slowly, letting the weight settle onto the makeshift blocks. It held. The axle was clear of the rut. He straightened up, his back protesting with a series of sharp cracks. He rolled his shoulder, the muscles burning. The wind picked that moment to die completely. For a full minute, the valley was silent and still. The dust settled. The air grew heavy and hot. It was as if the world was holding its breath, tired from the struggle. Eliza Hart stood on the other side of the wagon, breathing heavily, her hands on her hips. Her eyes met his over the dusty canvas cover. They were still wary, still guarded, but the sharp edge of defiance had softened slightly. The town of Red Hollow was a collection of clapboard buildings huddled in the valley's gut, a place where news traveled faster than a horse at full gallop. It was a town that fed on whispers, where a sideways glance could be spun into a declaration of war by supper time. On the porch of the general store, Old Man Hemlock lowered his spyglass. He'd been watching the distant drama unfold for the last 10 minutes. He turned to Silas Croft, the blacksmith, who was trying to enjoy a slice of apple in the shade. "Well, I'll be," Hemlock muttered, his voice a conspiratorial wheeze. "Looks like Lonesome Cole Merrick's finally found himself some company." Silas grunted, unimpressed. "Wagon's broke. He's helpin'." "Helpin'," Hemlock chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "I saw him. He moved in real close, had his shoulder right up against her. Then he pulled her right into his chest when she nearly slipped on some scree, right there on the open road." The reality had been far less dramatic. As they worked to maneuver a replacement wheel, a spare she'd had lashed, improbably, to the side of the wagon, Eliza's foot had slipped on a patch of loose shale. She'd stumbled backward, arms flailing for a second. Cole, standing behind her, had simply put out his hands and caught her by the shoulders, steadying her until she found her footing. The contact lasted no more than 3 seconds. It was impersonal, a simple act of preventing a fall. He had felt the surprising solidness of her, the rigid tension in her back. Then he had let go, but in Hemlock's spyglass, and soon in his telling, it became an embrace, an act of possession. By the time the story reached the saloon that evening, Cole Merrick, the brooding recluse who'd barely spoken 2 words to anyone since the fire, had pulled a strange woman into a passionate clinch in broad daylight. The truth didn't stand a chance. Back on the slope, the job was done. The new wheel was bolted on, solid and true. Eliza kicked at the blocks, freeing the wagon. It settled with a sigh of wood and steel. She walked to the front and picked up the reins, her movement still stiff with pride. She looked at Cole, who stood by his horse, patiently waiting. The sun was beginning to dip toward the western peaks, painting the dust-filled air in shades of orange and bruised purple. "I suppose I should thank you," she said, the words sounding like they'd been pulled from her throat with pliers. Cole just nodded once. He wasn't a man who needed thanks. He saw a problem. He fixed it. It was the same instinct that made him mend a broken fence line or set a calf's leg. It was just work that needed doing. He swung himself up onto Gideon's back. The saddle creaked its familiar song. Eliza climbed onto the wagon's high seat, the wooden bench groaning under her weight. She flicked the reins, and the heavy horses leaned into their harnesses. The wagon lurched forward, its wheels finding purchase. She didn't look back. Cole watched her go, a solitary figure driving into the growing shadows of the valley. He turned Gideon in the opposite direction, toward his own empty ranch house, the lowing calves a weary chorus ahead of him. 2 horses, 2 people, turning their backs on each other, leaving nothing between them but the settling dust, falling soft and gray as ash. High above, so high they were just dark specks against the deepening sky, a pair of vultures circled on the thermal currents. They floated effortlessly, masters of the vast, empty air, watching the small dramas of the earth unfold below them. They were patient. They knew that. In a land this hard, everything eventually came to rest, down on the ground. A story had just begun. 2 lives began to run on parallel tracks in Red Hollow, close enough to feel the vibration of the other, but never quite touching. They moved to the rhythms of work and necessity. Their days measured not in hours, but in tasks completed, debts tallied, and the slow, grinding passage of the sun across a merciless sky. Eliza Hart found a room for rent above Mrs. Gable's dressmaking shop, a cramped, stuffy space that smelled of old fabric and lavender sachets. The window overlooked the dusty main street, offering a view of every soul that came and went. She paid a month's rent in coin that was worn smooth from travel, And then she set to work. From her wagon, she unloaded the tools of her trade-alls, needles of varying sizes, thick spools of waxed thread, and rolls of heavy canvas and treated leather. The next morning, a new sign hung from the porch post below her window. It was a simple piece of pine, the letters burned into the wood with a hot iron. Eliza Hart, saddle repair, canvas tarp, stitching, garment mending. The lettering was plain, strong, and gave no quarter. Her first days were quiet. The women of the town, accustomed to Mrs. Gable's delicate stitchery and gossip, eyed the new sign with suspicion. The men, hearing the saloon-brewed tale of her roadside encounter with Cole Merrick, would glance up at her window, their curiosity a tangible thing. She ignored them all. She sat at a small wooden table by the light of the window, her hands busy. She repaired the torn canvas cover of her own wagon, her needle plunging in and out of the thick fabric with a steady, rhythmic hiss. The work was hard, unforgiving. The thimble protected her finger, but the needle was sharp, and her mind was elsewhere for a moment. It slipped, piercing the fleshy pad of her thumb. She flinched, not at the pain, but at the lapse in concentration. A single, perfect drop of blood welled up and fell onto the pale canvas, a tiny red star on a field of beige. She stared at it for a second, a stark confirmation of her own tangible reality, then pressed her thumb to her lips and continued her work, stitching a neat, square patch over the stain. Cole Merrick's days were marked by a different kind of pressure. He rose before dawn, the chill of the house clinging to him. He tallied figures in a worn ledger by the light of a kerosene lamp, the numbers stark and unyielding. The cost of cattle feed from the general store was a long column of debt that grew with each passing week. Tucked in the worn leather of his wallet was a note from the Red Hollow Bank, which was, for all intents and purposes, Royce Dalrymple. The note was a promise of foreclosure, its due date circled in black ink. The paper itself felt heavy, a physical weight in his breast pocket every time he rode into town. It was a constant reminder that the land his father had broken, the ranch that held the ghosts of his family, was slipping through his fingers like dry soil. The town did not help. When he walked into the saloon for a rare drink, the low murmur of conversation would falter. The whispers followed him like his own shadow. Bad luck follows that man. They'd mutter behind a raised glass. The story of the barn fire from the year before was retold, embellished with each telling. They didn't remember the frantic, desperate work to save the herd. They didn't remember the way he'd collapsed, lungs full of smoke, after it was over. They only remembered the pillar of flame against the night sky, the loss, and the convenient, unspoken conclusion that Merrick was to blame. It was easier than blaming the dry season, or a stray spark, or the simple, cruel randomness of fate. He was a quiet man, and a quiet man made a perfect vessel for the town's fears and suspicions. To be near Cole Merrick, the whispers said, was to invite misfortune. A week after their meeting on the road, the stitching on Cole's saddle began to give way near the cinch strap. The leather was old, stressed by years of hard use. He thought of repairing it himself, as he always did. But the memory of the clean, efficient way Eliza Hart had handled her broken wagon stayed with him. He rode into town, the heavy saddle slung over his shoulder, and walked up the narrow stairs beside Mrs. Gable's shop. He found her bent over a torn horse blanket, the same intense focus on her face he'd seen on the road. The room was sparse, utilitarian. Tools were laid out in neat rows. A small cot was pushed against one wall. It was the room of a person who owned little and needed less. She looked up as a shadow fell across her table. Her eyes registered no surprise, only a quiet assessment. "The stitching's come loose," he said, placing the saddle on the floor. It landed with a heavy thud. Eliza put down her needle and came around the table. She knelt, her fingers tracing the frayed seam. They were strong hands, the nails cut short, the knuckles calloused. She ran her thumb over the worn leather, testing its integrity. "The whole seam needs to be redone. The leather's dried out here." She looked up at him. "It will take a few hours. I can wait," he said. She nodded and went to work. She didn't make small talk. She simply worked, her movements precise and confident. She chose a thick waxed thread and 2 heavy needles. She used an awl to open the old holes, her arm moving with practiced strength. Then she began to stitch, using a saddle stitch that created a locking seam, far stronger than the original. The only sounds were the scrape of the awl, the pull of the thread through the leather, and the faint ticking of a clock downstairs. Cole stood by the window, watching the street below, but his attention was on the steady, competent work happening behind him. The straight, even line of her stitches was deeply satisfying, a small line of order in a chaotic world. When she was finished, she rubbed the new seam with a block of beeswax to waterproof it. She stood and pushed the saddle toward him. "It will hold." He inspected the work. The seam was perfect, the stitches tight and uniform. It was the work of a true craftswoman. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins, placing more than the fair price on the table. She glanced at the coins, then back at him. She pushed 2 of them back across the table with her forefinger. "This is the price. It's good work," he insisted quietly. "I charge for the work, not for compliments." She replied, her gaze unwavering. "The price is enough." He hesitated for a moment, then scooped up the returned coins, the metal warm in his palm. He nodded, shouldered the repaired saddle, and left without another word. As he descended the stairs, he felt the ghost of a touch, the memory of her solid shoulders under his hands when she had slipped. It was a fleeting, unwelcome thought, and he pushed it away. On Sunday, the town gathered at the small white chapel that stood at the end of the street. The Reverend Michael, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles and kindness, had noticed the new woman in town. He had seen the way she carried herself, with a solitude that was different from Cole Merrick's. Cole's was a retreat. Hers was a bastion. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the bright, unforgiving sunlight, he approached her. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice a gentle baritone, "we find ourselves in need of a new voice for the choir. Our melody singer has moved to the next county." Eliza looked surprised. "I'm not a singer, Reverend." "Everyone who can speak can sing," he said with a smile. "Just a different arrangement of air. Please, consider it." She was hesitant, but there was a sincerity in the old man's eyes that she found difficult to refuse. The following Sunday, she stood in the small choir loft, a borrowed hymnal in her hands. When they began to sing, her voice joined the others. It was not the high, lilting soprano the town was used to. It was lower, a contralto, with a raw, honest quality. It wasn't a voice that sought to please the ear. It was a voice that simply was, unadorned and true. It filled the small church with a sound that was both sad and strong, like the wind that blew through the valley. Royce Dalrymple sat in the front pew, as he always did. He was a man whose presence filled any room he entered, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed out of place among the homespun and denim of the townsfolk. He exuded an aura of wealth and power. He was the owner of the bank, the primary contractor for the new railroad spur, and the holder of half the mortgages in Red Hollow. He saw the town not as a community, but as an asset on a ledger. And he had noticed Eliza Hart. He didn't see a skilled leather worker or a woman of quiet strength. He saw a novelty, an attractive, unmarried woman with an air of defiance. She was a new piece on the town's chessboard, and he enjoyed collecting new pieces. After the service, he cornered her near the church steps. "Miss Hart," he said, his smile smooth and polished. "A remarkable voice, truly." "Thank you, Mr. Dalrymple," she said, her tone polite but cool. "My company, the railroad, is expanding. We'll have a great need for new canvas tarps for the supply wagons. A very large contract." He let the words hang in the air. "I'm hosting a dinner for some investors next week. I would be honored if you would accompany me. We could discuss the contract then." He looked at her, his eyes appraising her the way a man might appraise a fine horse. He saw her worn boots, the simple cut of her dress, He was offering her a way out of her small, dusty room. The offer came with a clear, unspoken price. She was to be the pleasing ornament on his arm. Eliza looked directly into his eyes. She saw the calculation there, the casual assumption of his power. It was a look she knew well. She had left a comfortable home and a wealthy fiancé in the East to escape that very look. She had walked away from a marriage that would have turned her into nothing more than a beautiful possession to be displayed at parties. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Dalrymple, but I prefer to discuss business during business hours, and I don't attend parties." She walked away, leaving him standing on the steps, his polished smile tightening ever so slightly at the edges. He was not a man accustomed to being refused. That night, the salt wind returned, rattling the tin roof of the dress shop. The sound was a lonely clang, a metallic heartbeat in the dark. Eliza lay on her cot, unable to sleep. She lit a small lamp and took out a thin, leather-bound journal. By the flickering light, she dipped a pen in ink and wrote. The script was as neat and strong as her stitches. "Not fragile," she wrote. She paused, thinking of the long, empty road ahead. The whispers of the town. The predatory smile of Royce Dalrymple. She added a few more words. But not destined to be alone forever, either. Miles away, in the deep quiet of his own ranch, Cole Merrick was also awake. A new calf had developed a cough, a dry, racking sound that worried him. He pulled on his boots and a heavy coat and walked out to the barn. The air was cold, the stars brilliant in a moonless sky. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and animals. He found the sick calf huddled against its mother. He ran a hand along its back, feeling the tremor of each cough. He mixed a mash of warm bran and herbs, a remedy his father had taught him. As he knelt in the straw, coaxing the calf to eat, his mind drifted. He remembered the feel of the repaired saddle in his hands, the strength and rightness of the new seam, and he remembered the moment she had accepted the saddle from him, her hand brushing his for a second as she steadied it. It was a brief, accidental touch, but he remembered the warmth of her skin, a surprising, living heat against his own. It was a small thing, but in the vast, cold emptiness of his life, it felt like a flicker of firelight. The past is not a dead thing. In Red Hollow, it was a ghost that rode the salt wind, a constant presence that whispered through the dry grass and scratched at window panes. For Cole Merrick, it had a smell, wood smoke, scorched earth, and the sharp, sickening scent of burnt hair. It came back to him on a Tuesday, when the wind shifted and blew hot and dry from the west. The frame of his new, smaller barn shivered in the gusts, and the sound was enough to transport him. 1 year ago, the memory was branded into him, a scar deeper than the one on his wrist. It had been a night just like this one, the wind howling a mad sermon. He and his older brother, Wade, had been in the house, going over the accounts. Wade was the one with the head for numbers, the one who saw the path forward. Cole was the hands, the muscle, the one who knew the land. They were two halves of a whole, a partnership forged in the dust of the ranch their father had built. The first sign was the smell, a faint acridness that cut through the scent of brewing coffee. Then came the sound, a low, hungry roar that was not the wind. They had thrown open the door to a vision of hell. The big barn, the heart of the ranch, was a raging inferno. Flames licked 50 feet into the black sky, turning the night to a terrifying, flickering day. The terrified screams of the cattle trapped inside were a sound Cole would hear in his sleep for the rest of his life. He had stood frozen for a heartbeat, paralyzed by the sheer, destructive power of it. But Wade had moved. "The mares!" Wade had shouted, his face illuminated by the fire. The 2 prize mares, their best breeding stock, were in the end stalls. "The main door is gone! The side latch!" Before Cole could react, Wade was gone, a silhouette plunging into the smoke and chaos through the smaller side door. Cole had screamed his brother's name, a useless cry swallowed by the roar of the fire. He'd started to follow, but a falling beam had crashed down. blocking the entrance in a shower of sparks and embers. He had run to the water troughs, throwing useless buckets of water against a wall of heat that drove him back, singeing his hair and blistering his skin. The whole town saw the glow, and by the time anyone arrived, it was too late. The roof collapsed with a deafening groan, sending a geyser of flame and smoke toward the indifferent stars. In the pale, sick light of dawn, there was nothing left but the blackened, skeletal frame of the barn, and silence, a profound, terrible silence where the sounds of life had been. They found what was left of Wade near the side door, as if he'd been trying to get back out. Cole blamed himself. He was the one who had filled the lamps that afternoon. Had he spilled some kerosene, left a rag too close to the forge? He replayed every moment of that day, torturing himself with possibilities. The sheriff had called it a tragic accident, a stray spark from the forge ignited by the high winds. The town, however, preferred a different story. They whispered that Cole had been careless, that he had been drinking. The whispers grew, fed by the town's inherent suspicion of a man who kept to himself. In their version, Cole's carelessness had cost his brother his life. At the saloon, Royce Dalrymple had listened to the talk and offered his condolences, his face a mask of civic sympathy. But later, alone with his ledger, he had allowed himself a small, private smile as he looked at the Merrick account. The fire had destroyed not just a barn and a man, but the Merrick family's future. The insurance was a pittance, not nearly enough to cover the lost stock and the cost of rebuilding. Royce knew it was only a matter of time. He had savored the taste of his whiskey, smooth and satisfying, like a plan coming to fruition. Eliza heard the story in pieces, in the clipped phrases of Mrs. Gable, in the dropped voices of men passing under her window. She saw the way people looked at Cole when he rode through town, a mixture of pity and accusation. She pieced together the narrative of fire and death and blame. One afternoon, he came to her shop to have a harness strap mended. The work was simple, and as she stitched, the silence in the small room felt heavy, charged. She didn't look at him when she spoke, her eyes fixed on her work. "I heard about the fire, about your brother." He stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders stiffened. "It was a year ago." She pulled a stitch tight, her voice low and even. "Can you sleep at night?" It was a direct question, stripped of all pity or pretense. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple inquiry into the state of his soul. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the rhythmic pull of her thread. He finally turned, his face shadowed, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the dusty street. "I have calves to count now," he said. It was an admission and a deflection all at once, an acknowledgement of the sleepless nights and the grim, forward motion of a life that refused to stop for grief. He paid for the repair and left. Eliza watched him go, understanding that his ranch was not just his work, it was his penance. The new salt wind brought the ghost of that night back with it. The loose window frame in her room rattled, a persistent, unnerving rhythm. She could almost smell the smoke, a phantom scent that made the back of her throat tighten. It was a premonition, a feeling that the restless, hungry spirit of Red Hollow was stirring again. The next morning, the trouble began. The town's main water supply for livestock was a large, deep well at the edge of the common pasture, capped with a heavy wooden lid and a system of ropes and pulleys. To conserve water during the dry season, the townsfolk had pooled their money and paid Eliza to stitch a massive, multi-layered canvas tarp that was stretched over the well opening, drastically reducing evaporation. It was her first major commission, and she had done the work with pride, her stitches strong and her seams watertight. But now, the tarp was ruined. Someone had taken a knife to it during the night, slashing it from end to end in a single, brutal cut. The well was exposed to the hot, dry wind, and the water level was already visibly lower. Cattle, drawn by the scent of water, crowded the well, their lowing full of thirsty anxiety. They pushed and shoved against the fence posts, their patience worn thin by the heat. The sheriff, a portly, ineffectual man named Alden, declared it the work of vandals, probably boys with nothing better to do. But Eliza knew better. She ran her fingers along the edge of the cut. The canvas was thick, reinforced. This was not the work of a boy with a pocket knife. This required a long, sharp blade and a great deal of strength. She looked closer, her brow furrowed in concentration. The angle of the gash, the way the fibers of the canvas were sliced, the slight curve of the cut, it was all wrong. She had grown up with a left-handed father and had learned to recognize the subtle differences in the way things were cut, sawn, or stitched. This cut was made by a left-handed man. The thought clicked into place with another memory, the railroad crews she had seen working on the spur line outside of town. Their work was specialized. The men who drilled the blasting holes into rock faces. The drillers were known for their powerful arms and because of the cramped angles they often worked in. An unusually high number of them were left-handed. They used long, razor-sharp knives to cut fuses and trim blasting mats. It was a small detail, a whisper of a connection, but it felt solid and true. She said nothing to Sheriff Alden. He would have dismissed it as womanly fancy. Instead, she went back to her room, gathered her heaviest needles and a spool of thick oiled hemp fiber, and returned to the well. The repair would be a long, difficult job. The townsfolk who gathered to watch offered plenty of advice, but little help. She set to work under the blistering sun, her awl punching new holes, her needles weaving the hemp fiber in a strong, diagonal cross-stitch that would pull the two sides of the gash together and hold them against the tension. Her wrist, unaccustomed to this much heavy work in a single stretch, began to ache. The pain started as a dull throb and sharpened into a burning line that ran from her knuckles to her elbow. Sweat dripped from her forehead, stinging her eyes. She ignored it all, her focus absolute. Her world shrank to the point of the needle, the resistance of the canvas, the pull of the thread. Each stitch was a small act of defiance, a quiet refusal to let things fall apart. Cole arrived as the sun was beginning to set. He had seen the damaged tarp from a distance and had come to water his own small herd. He saw Eliza, a solitary figure hunched over her work, her face pale with exhaustion, her movements slow but still precise. The group of onlookers had long since dispersed, driven away by the heat and the tediousness of the labor. He watered his cattle at a nearby trough, then walked over to her. She didn't look up, her entire being concentrated on finishing the final few inches of the seam. He could see the tremor in her hand, the tightness around her mouth. When she finally knotted the last stitch and cut the thread, she tried to stand, but her legs were stiff and her head swam from the hours spent bent over in the heat. She swayed, and he reached out, his hand closing around her arm to steady her. He led her away from the well to the shade of a nearby water tower. "Sit," he said, his voice quiet. She sank onto the edge of the wooden platform, her body trembling with fatigue. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a dipper of cool water from his canteen. She drank it gratefully, the water clearing some of the fog from her head. "Thank you," she whispered. He only nodded, his gaze distant. His hand, which had been resting on her arm, dropped to her own. Her hand lay palm up on her knee, curled from the effort of gripping the needle. Her wrist was red and raw. He didn't try to take her hand. He simply laid his own over it, covering it. His hand was large, calloused, and heavy. It was a gesture that asked for nothing. It wasn't gentle or comforting in the conventional sense. It was simply a sharing of weight, a solid, tangible presence that seemed to say, "I am here. This is real." It was a moment of profound, unspoken connection, a silent acknowledgement of the struggle. They sat that way for a long time as the sky bled from orange to purple. From where they sat, they could see the far-off flicker of lights from the railroad work camp nestled in the hills. The lights were small, like a scattering of fireflies, but they held a sinister glow. They were a secret, a mystery smoldering in the twilight, like a live coal buried in a pile of cold ash, just waiting for the right wind to be fanned into a flame. The night was starless, A thick blanket of black pulled over Red Hollow. There was no moon, no celestial witness to the crime. The only sound was the incessant whisper of the salt wind, a sound so constant it had become a form of silence. Then, a new sound broke the rhythm, a metallic groan, the protest of a rusted iron wheel forced to turn. Two figures, their faces hidden by dark bandanas, put their shoulders to the large crank of the main irrigation sluice gate, a relic from an older, more ambitious farming attempt upriver. With a final, heavy clank, the gate lifted. Water, held back for a season, surged into the dry ditch. It was not a gentle release. It was a violation. Black water, thick with silt and malice, clawed at the banks of the channel that ran along the high ground of the valley. The channel had been designed to irrigate the lower pastures. Royce Dalrymple's men had a different purpose. They had already blocked the lower channels, forcing the entire volume of the flood toward one place, the low-lying pasture where Cole Merrick kept his calves. Cole woke to the sound of screaming. It was a high, thin sound of pure terror that cut through his sleep and yanked him into consciousness. He was on his feet before his eyes were fully open, pulling on his boots, his heart hammering against his ribs. The floor of the small ranch house was vibrating, a deep, resonant tremor that spoke of immense power. He threw open the door, and the roar of the water hit him like a physical blow. His pasture was gone. In its place was a churning black lake. The floodwater, channeled with cruel precision, was pouring over the banks of the ditch, turning his best grazing land into a swamp. In the center of the chaos was his holding pen, now a small island. The corner posts, driven deep into the earth, were shuddering under the assault of the current, and his calves, 30 of them, were trapped inside, their terrified cries almost lost in the din. They huddled on the highest patch of ground, a shrinking circle of life in a world of dark water. He ran, his boots sinking into the newly formed mud. The water was cold, a shocking contrast to the dry air. It swirled around his knees, pulling at him, trying to drag him down. The current was strong, carrying with it debris, tumbleweeds, branches, pieces of broken fencing. He reached the holding pen, the water now at his thighs. He could feel the vibration of the corner post through the soles of his boots. It was swaying, the wood groaning as the soil around its base washed away. If it gave, the fence would collapse, and the calves would be swept away into the darkness, miles away. In her room above the dress shop, Eliza was also awake. The rattle of her window was familiar, but the low, guttural roar that vibrated through the floorboards was not. It was the sound of a river where no river should be. She stood at the window, peering into the blackness. She could see nothing, but she could feel it. The town was asleep, deaf to the change. Her mind raced, connecting the slashed tarp at the well to this new, unnatural sound. It was an attack, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, who the target was. She didn't hesitate. She dressed in seconds, pulling on her sturdy trousers and boots. She grabbed a coil of thick rope and a roll of heavy, waterproofed canvas from her workshop. Her tools, her weapons. She didn't think about waking the sheriff. This wasn't a problem for a man like Alden. This was a battle. And you didn't send for a politician when a battle was raging. She ran down the stairs and into the deserted street, her footsteps echoing in the unnatural roar. She ran toward the sound, toward Cole's ranch, her lungs burning, the heavy roll of canvas digging into her shoulder. She found him fighting a losing war. He had his rope looped around the failing post, his back braced against a larger, more stable gate post, his entire body straining to hold the corner of the fence against the current. His muscles were cords of tension under his soaked shirt, his face a grim mask of exertion. The post was still swaying, losing ground with every new surge of water. Eliza didn't waste a word. She dropped the canvas and rope and waded into the churning water beside him. It was colder and stronger than she had expected, a living thing trying to tear her feet from under her. "Let out some slack," she yelled over the roar. Cole glanced at her, his eyes wide with surprise and something else, despair. "It's no good, the ground is washing out." "Slack," she commanded again, her voice sharp as a blade. He obeyed. his muscles screaming in protest as he eased the tension. The post groaned and leaned dangerously. Eliza worked with frantic speed, wrapping the base of the post with the heavy canvas, her hands plunging into the icy, muddy water. She wrapped it again and again, creating a thick, waterproof collar. "Now loop your rope over the canvas and throw me the end." He understood instantly. The canvas would stop the water from eroding the soil directly at the base. It would give the post a fighting chance. He passed her the rope, and she expertly wove it through itself, creating a slip knot that would tighten under pressure. "Pull!" she screamed. "Pull it tight, Slow. Stop when I say stop." Cole dug his heels into the mud and leaned back, taking up the strain. The rope bit into the canvas, and the post straightened by an inch. The calves, sensing a shift, cried out again, a sound of desperate hope. Eliza stayed by the post, her hands on the rope, guiding the tension, her eyes fixed on the straining wood. "More!" she shouted. "Another foot!" He pulled, every fiber of his being focused on the rope, on the fight. The water surged, a new wave of debris swirling around them. Eliza, her footing precarious in the slick, churning mud, suddenly slipped. Her feet went out from under her, and she fell backward with a sharp cry. At that same moment, a dark shape detached itself from the current, a heavy, waterlogged railroad tie, tumbling end over end. It was moving fast, aimed directly at her. Cole saw it. He didn't think, he reacted. He dropped the rope, lunging forward in two great, splashing strides. He caught her, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her hard against his chest. He twisted his body, putting his own back to the oncoming danger. The railroad tie struck him squarely between the shoulder blades. The impact was a sickening, heavy thud that drove the air from his lungs. He grunted in pain but did not fall. He held her, a human shield against the black water and its weapons. For a second, they were frozen, an island of stillness in the chaos. She was pressed against him, her face buried in his chest, his arms locked around her. She could feel the violent, frantic drumming of his heart against her ear. Then, the instinct for survival, the sheer force of her will, took over. She pushed against him, her voice a raw, furious growl, torn from her throat. "I'm not fragile." It wasn't an accusation. It was a declaration of war, a roar of defiance against the water, the darkness, the unseen enemy who had done this. Even as she spoke, her hands were moving, finding the rope she had been securing. She was still fighting, still working, her fingers expertly tightening the final knot, pulling it taut even as she was held in his arms. The heat of his body soaked through their wet shirts, a stark contrast to the icy water. The knot held. Cole released her, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his back screaming in protest. They both scrambled for the main rope he had dropped. Together, they pulled, and this time, the post held firm, anchored by Eliza's canvas and knot. The water still raged, but its primary weapon, erosion, had been blunted. The corner of the pen was secure. The worst of the flood began to pass, its initial, violent surge spending itself across the wide pasture. The water level dropped. The current slowed to a sullen, muddy flow. Exhaustion, cold, and the aftermath of adrenaline hit them both at once. They collapsed onto the muddy bank, side by side, their legs still in the water. They sat in silence, breathing hard, their breath making clouds of steam in the cold night air. The only sounds were the gurgle of the receding water and the soft, whimpering cries of the calves, who were now safe. The next day, the story arrived in the saloon. It was carried by one of the men Royce had paid, his face still smug from the night's work. He bought a round of whiskey and began to talk, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You should have seen it," he said with a greasy chuckle. "Old man Merrick, out there in the dark, with that new seamstress woman. The water's raging. And what are they doing? She's climbing all over him. Had her hands all over his chest, pulling him down in the mud with her. Saw it with my own eyes." The men at the bar laughed. It was a good story, salty and mean. It painted Merrick as a fool and the new woman as cheap. It was a story designed to strip them of their dignity. to turn their desperate struggle for survival into a sordid joke. The laughter was the sound of a town that fed on the misfortune of others, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the whiskey-stained walls. Cole heard the whispers when he went to town for supplies. He saw the smirks, the sideways glances. The shame and anger burned in his gut, hotter than any fire. It wasn't for himself that he felt it. It was for Eliza. He had brought this on her. His trouble had become her trouble, staining her name, making her a target. He found her by the repaired well, checking her stitches. "I'm selling the ranch," he said, his voice flat, defeated. "I'll take Dalrymple's offer. This shouldn't be happening to you. I'll go. It'll stop when I'm gone." Eliza looked up from her work, her eyes dark and fierce. She looked at his tired, beaten face. Then she turned her head and spat a single, contemptuous stream of saliva into the dust. "Let them thirst for gossip," she said, her voice hard as forged steel. "We have work to do. The calves need clean water." Her strength was a physical thing, a force that seemed to push back against his despair. She would not let him break. She would not let them win. She turned and started walking toward the sluice gate. "Come on," she said over her shoulder. "Let's go see how they did it." Together, they walked the path of the flood, their boots making sucking sounds in the deep mud. At the sluice gate, the evidence of the sabotage was plain to see. The wheel had been forced, the lock broken, and there, in a patch of soft, undisturbed silt beside the mechanism, was a single, perfect footprint. It was not a cowboy boot. The heel was wide and low, the sole thick, and embedded in the sole was a pattern of hobnails in a distinct diagonal cross, designed for traction on rock and uneven ground. It was the boot of a railroad man, the boot of one of Royce Dalrymple's drillers. The proof, pressed into the mud, was as clear and damning as a signature on a confession. The morning light was thin and gray, the color of dirty dishwater. It did little to soften the scene of devastation in Cole's pasture. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a thick blanket of black, foul-smelling silt that had suffocated the grass. The air was heavy with the stench of decay. It was a landscape of violation. They began at the sluice gate, their boots sinking into the mud. They were not investigators, not lawmen. They were two people with nothing left to lose, and that gave their search a meticulous, patient intensity. While Cole examined the broken lock, Eliza's eyes were drawn to a piece of frayed rope snagged on the iron handle of the gate wheel. It was a short length of coarse hemp, left behind in the criminal's haste. She worked it free, her fingers careful, as if handling a venomous snake. She brought it to her nose. The scent was faint but unmistakable, cutting through the smell of the mud. It was the sharp, industrial perfume of kerosene. Her mind flashed back to the whispers about the fire that had killed Cole's brother, a fire that had been attributed to a stray spark, but which smelled, in its ghostly memory, exactly like this. The acrid scent seemed to work its way under her fingernails, a persistent, oily residue of the night's work. Cole saw the look on her face. He came over, his own face a grim mask. He took the rope, sniffed it once, and a muscle jumped in his jaw. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The same thought, the same sickening connection, had sparked in both their minds. He turned his attention back to the ground, his eyes scanning the churned-up mud near the mechanism. He knelt, his gaze fixed on something half-buried near the damning footprint. It was a glint of metal. He dug at it carefully with his fingertips, pulling it free from the mud's grip. It was a single, broken hobnail, sheared off a boot heel. It was identical to the pattern in the footprint. He wiped it clean on his trousers. The metal was stamped with small, clear letters. They were tiny, but in the flat morning light, they were perfectly legible. R.D. Company, Royce Dalrymple Company. The two pieces of evidence lay in Cole's palm, the oily, frayed piece of rope and the small, brutal piece of metal. They were not much, a scrap of trash and a broken nail. In a court of law, they would be dismissed. But here, in the cold light of this ruined morning, They felt as heavy and damning as a signed confession. They looked at each other. No words were exchanged. Their shared understanding was a silent, solid thing between them. The saloon whispers, the knowing smirks, the legal pressure, it all coalesced around these two small objects. This was not random misfortune. This was a war. And they had just found the enemy's ammunition. They could not go to Sheriff Alden. He was a man who followed the path of least resistance, and that path always led directly to Royce Dalrymple's front pocket. They needed a sanctuary, a place of unimpeachable integrity. There was only one such place in Red Hollow. They walked into town as the shopkeepers were sweeping their porches and the smell of bacon was beginning to drift from the hotel cafe. They moved with a shared, urgent purpose that made people turn and watch. They ignored the stairs. They walked directly to the white chapel at the end of the street and entered without knocking. Reverend Michael was at the altar, polishing the brass candle holders. He looked up as they approached, his old, kind eyes taking in their mud-caked boots, their exhausted faces, and the fierce, desperate light in their eyes. He had seen that look before, in soldiers returning from the war and in farmers who had lost a crop to hail. It was the look of people pushed to the very edge. "Cole, Miss Hart," he said, his voice a calm harbor in their storm. "What trouble has found you?" Cole opened his hand and showed the Reverend the rope and the hobnail. He explained nothing of the flood, nothing of the whispers. He simply said, "We need you to keep these safe. Reverend, somewhere no one would think to look, somewhere they won't get lost." The old man looked from the evidence to their faces. He saw the truth there, raw and undeniable. He didn't ask for details he knew they couldn't give. He simply nodded, his face settling into lines of grave understanding. He led them to a small table near the chancel, where the heavy oak collection box sat. He unlocked it with a small iron key. The inside was lined with worn red velvet. It was a space meant for the town's offerings, its hopes, its meager expressions of faith. Cole placed the hobnail on the velvet. Eliza laid the coiled piece of rope beside it. The two crude objects looked alien and profane in the sacred space. The Reverend closed the lid, the lock clicking shut with a sound of finality. "God's house has held secrets before," he said quietly. "It will hold these." Their evidence was safe, but it was not enough. They needed more. They needed to understand the enemy. That afternoon, their silent pact took shape. Eliza took a large, empty laundry basket from Mrs. Gable's back porch. She filled it with a few old rags to make it look used and set off for the railroad camp in the hills. To any observer, she was just a woman looking for mending work, a common enough sight. Her presence was a perfect disguise, rendering her all but invisible. She walked through the camp, a place of raw, masculine energy. Men with sweat-stained shirts and calloused hands were everywhere, the air thick with the sounds of hammers on steel and the smell of coal smoke. She did not make eye contact. Her gaze was kept respectfully downcast, but her eyes missed nothing. She moved with a slow, deliberate pace, ostensibly looking for a foreman to ask about laundry services. In reality, she was conducting a census. She noted the boots first. Dozens of pairs, all caked with mud and dust, all bearing the same distinctive hobnail pattern she had seen in the mud. Then she watched their hands. She watched them as they handled tools, as they ate their midday meal, as they rolled cigarettes. She counted. One man here, using a knife with his left hand to slice a piece of bread. Two more over there, a team working a cross-cut saw. The man on the left pulling with his dominant arm. Another, a foreman, making notes on a clipboard, his left hand guiding the pencil. She didn't stare. A glance, a flicker of observation, and the information was filed away in her mind. By the time she'd left the camp an hour later, having spoken to no one of consequence, she had a number. Of the 50 or so men she had seen clearly, at least 7 were left-handed, a far higher percentage than normal. It wasn't proof, but it was a pattern. While Eliza was conducting her subtle infiltration, Cole was engaged in a different kind of investigation. He sat at the rough-hewn table in his kitchen. The deed to his land spread out before him. It was a formidable document, full of the dense, labyrinthine language of the law. He had read it a dozen times before, but now he read it with new eyes, searching for traps, for loopholes, for the legal weapon Dalrymple would surely use against him. He found it in the fourth paragraph. The ink was faded, the language archaic, but the meaning was chillingly clear. It was a standard clause, common in deeds for land that bordered a potential railroad right-of-way. It stated that in the event of damage to the property from a natural disaster, an act of God, or other unforeseen calamity, the railroad company, as a party of interest for regional development, would be given the primary option to acquire the distressed property at a prearranged and fair market value. The words hit him like a physical blow. A flood, a sudden, unexpected deluge in the middle of a dry season. It was the perfect manufactured act of God. Royce Dalrymple hadn't just attacked his herd. He had created the legal justification to steal his land. The fire, the flood. They were two parts of the same brutal strategy, designed to break him in spirit and then dispossess him in the eyes of the law. He felt a cold, helpless fury wash over him. How could he fight this? How could a lone man fight a piece of paper that had the full weight of the law behind it? Eliza returned as dusk was settling. She found him sitting at the table, staring at the deed, his face pale and drawn. She told him what she had learned at the camp, about the boots, about the left-handed men. He listened, his eyes dark, and then he pushed the deed across the table, his finger pointing to the clause. She read it slowly, her lips moving silently. She read it a second time, letting the legal poison sink in. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. She looked up from the paper and met his gaze. He looked defeated, cornered. She leaned forward, her own finger coming down to rest on the document, not far from his, but she wasn't pointing at the words. She was looking at him, her eyes holding an unwavering, clear-burning fire. "A natural disaster," she said, her voice low and steady. She tapped the paper. "Tell me, Cole, does an act of God use a saw to cut a sluice gate open?" The simple, direct question cut through the legal fog like a bolt of lightning. It was the truth, plain and unadorned. It was the answer. They had the hobnail. They had the kerosene-soaked rope. They had the slash on the weld tarp. And now they had the saw marks on the sluice gate. They had the human tools of the crime. All they had to do was prove it. A new understanding passed between them in that moment, forged in the quiet of the lamp-lit kitchen. This was their fight now. Together. "I can't protect you from the whispers. Eliza," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I can't protect you from Dalrymple." "I don't need a protector," she said, her voice firm. "I need a partner." She stood up. "You know this land. You know how to defend it. You keep watch over the ranch. Protect the calves. Be the wall." She paused. "And I will be the needle. I'll find the thread that unravels all of this. I'll keep digging." It was an agreement, sealed not with a handshake, but with a shared look of grim resolve. No one was the property of the other. No one was standing behind anyone else. They were simply two people, standing together against the storm. That night, she did not return to her room in town. She stayed at the ranch, a silent guest in the spare room. But she did not sleep. By the light of a single lantern, she set to work, stitching together several large pieces of heavy black canvas. It was a tarp, far larger than any she had made before, designed to be thrown over the holding pen as a shield against the night. As she worked, Cole stood watch outside. He didn't hover. He simply existed in the darkness, a silent, vigilant presence. He walked the perimeter of the pasture, a rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm, his eyes scanning the dark hills. The only sound was the rhythmic hiss and pull of Eliza's needle, a steady, reassuring sound in the vast, threatening silence. The line of white thread against the black canvas was stark and clean, each stitch a small, deliberate act of defiance. It was the sound of a heart that had found its steady beat again. Then, From far away, a new sound cut through the night. It was the long, mournful cry of a train whistle from the direction of the railroad camp. The sound echoed through the valley, a lonely, powerful proclamation of intent. It was not a warning. It was a challenge. The quiet of the third night was different. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the tense, coiled silence of a held breath. Cole stood in the deep shadow of the water tower, the familiar weight of his Winchester in his hands. He was a statue carved from the darkness, his senses stretched to their breaking point. In the small ranch house, a single lamp cast a pale yellow square onto the hard-packed earth. He knew Eliza was inside, not sleeping, but working, her hands moving with the same steady, defiant rhythm as his own heartbeat. The attack came with the subtlety of a rock slide. There was no warning shout, no clumsy approach. One moment, there was only the wind. The next, shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness of the fence line. 3 of them, moving low and fast. They weren't ranchers. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of wolves, or soldiers. One of them carried a torch, a greasy, sputtering flame that seemed to drink the darkness around it, while the other 2 moved swiftly toward the holding pen. The torchbearer ran toward a large haystack near the barn, a relic from the last harvest. He plunged the flame into the dry heart of the stack. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a hungry whoosh, the hay ignited. Flames erupted, a sudden, violent blossoming of orange and red that threw the entire ranch into a flickering, hellish light. The plan was clear: use the fire as a diversion, its roar and light to mask their true purpose. But they hadn't counted on the whistle. As the first flames climbed the haystack, a sound cut through the night, sharp and piercing. A blade of pure sound that sliced through the roar of the fire and the rising panic of the calves. It was a boatswain's whistle, high and clear, a signal prearranged, a sound that said, "Now." Cole was already moving. He didn't run toward the fire. That was the trap. He ran for Gideon, who was stamping nervously in his corral. As he vaulted onto the horse's bare back, he saw the other 2 intruders. They had cut the ropes of the holding pen and were driving the terrified calves out into the open pasture, pushing them north, away from the fire and toward the dark ridges. He dug his heels into Gideon's sides, and the powerful horse leaped forward, muscles coiling and releasing like a sprung trap. The fire blazed behind them, a monstrous, hungry tongue licking at the sky, casting their galloping shadow long and distorted before them. Cole gained on them fast, Gideon's hooves thundering a frantic rhythm against the hard earth. He was a whirlwind of righteous fury, a single-minded force of retribution. As he closed the distance, he saw the house door fly open. Eliza stood silhouetted against the lamplight, a small, fierce figure. He wheeled Gideon in a tight circle, the horse churning the earth. "Eliza, stay back," he roared, his voice raw. "They're driving them to the gorge," she shouted back, her voice carrying with surprising strength over the din. "To Juniper Bridge, you'll be trapped." She was already running toward him. He knew in that instant that arguing was a waste of breath. She simply would not obey. He reached down, extending his arm, and she took it, in one fluid motion, born of desperation and instinct. He pulled her up behind him. She landed with a solid thud, her arms immediately locking around his waist, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt. Her body was a warm, solid presence against his back, a startling anchor in the chaos. "Go," she urged, her voice in his ear. He needed no further encouragement. Gideon surged forward again, now carrying 2, his powerful stride barely slowing. The world became a blur of motion and sound. The roar of the fire, the thunder of hooves, the panicked crying of the calves, the whistle of the wind in their ears. They were a single entity, a 4-legged, 2-headed creature of vengeance, flying across the plains. The intruders were good, pushing the herd hard, forcing them toward the narrow opening of the gorge. Juniper Bridge was an old, forgotten structure, built by prospectors years ago. It spanned a deep, dry ravine, its pine planks bleached and warped by the sun and wind. its anchor ropes frayed and unreliable. It was a death trap, a perfect place to corner a herd and its pursuer. As they entered the narrow canyon, the ground grew rough, littered with rocks. Gideon's pace slowed, his movements becoming more careful. The two rustlers were just ahead now, flanking the terrified herd, pushing the last of the calves onto the groaning planks of the bridge. The lead rider, a big man on a dark horse, turned in his saddle and fired a shot. The bullet whined past Cole's ear, close enough to feel its heat. He instinctively hunched lower, shielding Eliza with his body. "Don't chase them." Eliza's voice was tight, strained against the wind, but clear. "They want you on the bridge." She tightened her grip on his waist. "Slow down. Find the rhythm of the wind." Her words cut through his rage. She was right. A blind charge was suicide. He fought his instincts, pulling back slightly on Gideon's neck, letting the horse find its footing on the treacherous ground. The wind was gusting through the canyon, a wild, unpredictable force. He had to time this right. He drew his own pistol, a heavy Colt, its familiar weight a comfort in his hand. The bridge was 100 yards ahead. The two men were now on the far side, trying to pull the last of the hesitant calves across. The anchor rope on the near side of the bridge was thick, a dark line against the paler rock of the canyon wall. It was a desperate, impossible shot. From a moving horse, in the dark, with the wind howling. "Now," Eliza whispered, her head touching his back. "The wind is still." He took the shot. In the space between heartbeats, in the lull of the wind, he aimed and fired. The night exploded in a flash of orange. The heavy slug tore through the air and struck the anchor rope. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a giant sigh, the old fibers gave way. The bridge lurched, one side dropping with a scream of tortured wood and snapping cables. Half the structure tore away from the canyon wall and plunged into the darkness below, taking the lead rustler and his horse with it. His curse was a ragged tear in the fabric of the night, cut short by the final, echoing crash from the bottom of the ravine. The terrified calves, finding their path to safety suddenly cut off and a gaping void before them, spun around in a panic. They stampeded back the way they had come, a wave of terrified bodies pouring off the remaining, dangerously tilted section of the bridge. The second rustler, who had been on the far side, was now trapped, but he was not defeated. With a wild cry, he leaped from his horse across the newly formed chasm, landing on the stable side of the bridge. Not 10 feet from them, he rolled and came up with a long, wicked-looking knife in his hand. He lunged. Cole was still trying to control Gideon, who was spooked by the noise and the stampeding calves. He turned to meet the attacker, but the man was fast. The knife swept in a wide, vicious arc. Eliza moved. She didn't scream or flinch. As the man's arm came around, she drove her elbow back, hard, into his exposed ribs. He grunted, the air driven from his lungs, his attack faltering for a crucial second. In that second, Eliza's hand shot out. She didn't grab for the blade. She grabbed his wrist, the one holding the knife. Her grip was like a vice. She twisted, using his own momentum against him. The knife clattered to the wooden planks. With a final, brutal wrench, she slammed his hand down onto the railing, her body pinning his arm. She had his left wrist, his dominant hand, the hand of a driller. Cole was off his horse now, circling around to help. The third man, the one who had set the fire, had been caught in the stampede of returning calves and thrown from his horse. He was now limping toward them, his face a mask of fury. Cole moved to intercept him. As he did, a stream of salty sweat, dislodged by his sudden movement, ran down from his hairline and directly into his eyes. For a moment, he was blind. The world dissolved into a searing, white-hot sting. He blinked frantically, but it was no use. He could hear the man approaching, could hear his ragged breathing, but he could see nothing but a painful, blurry haze. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. "Cole!" Her voice was low, steady, and close. It cut through the pain and the panic. "Look at me!" He forced his stinging eyes open, turning his head toward the sound of her voice. Through the watery blur, he could just make out her shape. Her eyes, fixed on his, were dark, intense, and as solid as the canyon walls around them. They were an anchor, a post driven deep into solid ground. The panic receded. He took a breath. His vision began to clear. He saw the second attacker coming at him, a fist raised. Cole ducked under the wild swing and drove his shoulder into the man's midsection. They both went down in a tangle of limbs. The fight was short and brutal. By the time it was over, 2 men were breathing heavily, their hands bound tightly with the ropes from their own saddles. One of them had a broken nose. The other, the left-handed man Eliza had disarmed, nursed his bruised ribs, his eyes full of a sullen, hateful fire. In his saddlebag, Cole found a small canvas pouch, heavy with its contents. He emptied it into his hand. A dozen or more brand-new hobnails, each one stamped with the telltale RD Company, glinted in the first pale light of dawn. The sky in the east was turning from gray to a soft, hopeful pink. The broken bridge stood against it, a jagged silhouette, like a broken promise. The fire at the ranch had burned itself out, leaving only a plume of dark smoke to stain the morning sky. And from the pasture below, a new sound began to rise. The terrified cries of the calves were quieting, replaced by the softer, questioning lows of young animals who have survived a great terror and now seek the comfort of the familiar. They were coming home, one by one. They trickled back into the holding pen, their fears slowly giving way to the instinct for safety and rest. The sound of their return was like the slow, subsiding sobs of a child who has finally been comforted after a long and terrible nightmare. The church was not a courtroom, but on that sun-drenched morning, it became one. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and the palpable tension of a town holding its breath. Every bench was filled. Farmers in their Sunday best, shopkeepers with worried faces, and saloon regulars looking uncomfortable in the holy light. They were all there, drawn by the promise of a reckoning. At the front, before the altar, stood a small, makeshift table. Cole and Eliza were on one side. The 2 captured men, their hands still bound, stood slumped between them. On the other side stood Sheriff Alden, looking flustered and out of his depth. Reverend Michael held the small iron key to the collection box. All eyes were on him, with a quiet reverence that seemed to magnify the gravity of the moment. He unlocked the box. The click of the lock was a sharp, definitive sound in the heavy silence. He opened the heavy oak lid and, one by one, placed the items on the table. First, the small canvas pouch of hobnails, their RD Company, stamping, glinting in the shafts of light slanting down from the high windows. Then, the greasy, kerosene-soaked piece of rope. Finally, Eliza had added a new piece of evidence, a square she had cut from the slashed well tarp, showing the clean, powerful, left-handed cut. The evidence lay there, a small, sordid collection of objects that told a story of violence and conspiracy. The 2 bound men refused to look up, their gazes fixed on the dusty floorboards. Just as Sheriff Alden cleared his throat to begin the proceedings, the heavy church doors swung open. Royce Dalrymple entered. He was not alone. Beside him walked a man in a crisp city suit, carrying a leather briefcase, a lawyer. Royce moved down the aisle with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. He nodded condescendingly to the Reverend, ignored Cole and Eliza completely, and took a position on the other side of the table as if he were the one presiding. "Sheriff," Royce began, his voice smooth and reasonable, a stark contrast to the raw tension in the room. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding. These men," he gestured dismissively at the 2 captives, "are employees of my company who were unfortunately in the wrong place at the wrong time, likely chasing stray cattle. As for Mr. Merrick's recent troubles with a bit of high water, it is indeed a tragedy." His lawyer stepped forward and opened his briefcase, producing a familiar, formidable document. It was Cole's land deed. He spread it on the table, his manicured finger tapping a specific paragraph. "However," Royce continued, his voice hardening slightly, It is a natural tragedy. The deed is quite clear. The clause regarding acts of God and unforeseen calamities is ironclad. My company has a legal, prior claim to purchase the Merrick property in just such a circumstance. This is a simple matter of contract law, not some wild fantasy of back-alley vengeance. Sheriff Alden, who also served as the town's acting magistrate in minor disputes, looked from the deed to the crude evidence. He was a man caught between a powerful force and an inconvenient truth. He picked up one of the hobnails, squinting at the letters. He sniffed the rope. He looked at the bound men, who flinched under his gaze. "This requires verification," Alden stammered, clearly playing for time. He was not a brave man, but even he could not ignore the evidence before him. "I will grant a period of 3 days to verify the claims and to question these men further." Royce Dalrymple smiled. It was a cold, predatory expression that did not touch his eyes. His teeth were very white, like polished bone. 3 days, of course. Sheriff, take all the time you need. The law is patient." He was not worried. 3 days was more than enough time for him to apply the right kind of pressure, to remind the sheriff where his loyalties and his salary truly lay. It was then that Eliza stepped forward. She did not raise her voice. She did not gesture wildly. She stood, straight and calm, and all eyes turned to her. In the quiet intensity of the moment, a beam of sunlight caught the simple pin she used to fasten the cuff of her sleeve, and it flashed like a spark. "Mr. Dalrymple speaks of an act of God," she began, her voice clear and steady, carrying to the back of the church. "Last week, the town's well tarp was slashed. The cut was made by a sharp, heavy blade, wielded by a left-handed man." She looked directly at the captive she had disarmed on the bridge. He visibly shrank. Then came the flood. She continued, her gaze sweeping over the faces in the pews before settling on Judge Alden. "A flood in the driest part of the season, caused by a sluice gate that was forced open. The wood of the gate bears saw marks. The lock was broken. Are these the tools that God uses for his calamities?" She pointed to the evidence on the table. "These hobnails are from the boots worn by the railroad drillers. The men in this room have seen them every day at the work camp. This rope smells of kerosene, the same substance that likely fueled the fire that killed Wade Merrick a year ago. These things are not acts of God. They are acts of men. They are acts of greed." She finished speaking, and the silence that followed was profound. She had not presented legal arguments. She had presented a narrative of cold, hard facts. She had stitched the events together into a pattern as clear and strong as the seams on a saddle. She had given the town a story they could understand, a truth they could feel in their bones. Cole stood beside her, his throat tight with an emotion he couldn't name. It was awe. It was gratitude. It was a fierce, desperate wave of protectiveness that was so powerful it was a physical force. He watched her, this woman who had walked into his life out of the dust, and saw in her a strength he had never known. He had an overwhelming urge to pull her into his arms, to hold her, to shield her from the venomous glare of Royce Dalrymple and the prying, judgmental eyes of the entire town. He started to raise his arm, to reach for her, but then he heard it, the small, unmistakable creak of a wooden bench as someone in the pews shifted their weight to get a better view. The sound was a splash of cold water. They were being watched. Every move they made was being catalogued, ready to be twisted into the next saloon whisper. His gesture would not be seen as one of comfort, but of possession. It would be another chapter in the sordid tale the gossips were so eager to write. His hand fell back to his side. The meeting dissolved into a confused murmur. Judge Alden called for order. Royce and his lawyer conferred in low, angry tones, and the Reverend quietly returned the evidence to the safety of God's lockbox. Cole and Eliza slipped out onto the church porch, into the clean, bright air. The tension of the church had been a suffocating weight, and for a moment, they both just breathed. Eliza leaned against one of the heavy wooden posts that supported the porch roof, her shoulders slumping slightly now that the ordeal was over. She turned her head and looked at him, her dark eyes seeing straight through him. "I saw you," she said, her voice soft but direct. "In there. You were going to put your arm around me." Cole felt a flush of shame. He looked down at his boots. They were all staring. I didn't want to give them more to talk about. She pushed herself off the post and took a step closer to him. "Cole," she said, and the way she spoke his name made him look up. "I am not a piece of delicate china that will shatter if a foul word is spoken about me. I am not fragile." She held his gaze, her own unwavering. "You will not embrace me to shield me from their words. You will not touch me for them. You will do it when you need to. When the reason is for you, not for them. Do you understand?" He understood completely. It was a lesson in respect, in partnership, that went deeper than any legal agreement. He gave a single, slow nod. Then, acting on an impulse that came from a place deeper than thought, he closed the small space between them. He gently placed his hands on her shoulders, leaned in, and rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. Hers were open. For one long second, they just stood there. The contact was electric, a silent communication of everything that had passed between them, the desperation, the fear, the fight, the burgeoning trust. It was not an embrace. It was an anchoring, a second that held the weight of an entire season of struggle and growth. Later that afternoon, the town's fragile new conscience was put to the test. The ladies of the church auxiliary had organized a small fair on the town common to raise money for a new, stronger well cover. It was a small, hopeful gesture. Royce Dalrymple saw it as an act of defiance. He sent 3 of his railroad crew, large, belligerent men, to disrupt it. They swaggered onto the common, knocking over a bake sale table and kicking dust onto the quilts laid out for sale. In the past, the townsfolk would have scattered, melting back into their homes and shops, unwilling to cross Royce. But something had shifted that morning in the church. As one of the thugs reached for a donation jar, Silas Croft, the blacksmith, stepped in his way. Silas was not a young man, but his arms were thick as oak limbs. "That's far enough," he said, his voice a low rumble. Then another man stepped up beside him, and another. Soon, a wall of ordinary men, farmers, merchants, old-timers stood between Royce's men and the fair. They held no weapons. They made no threats. They just stood there, a silent, immovable line. It was the first time the town had ever chosen to stand with Cole Merrick instead of in judgment of him. It was the first time they had chosen each other over their fear of Royce Dalrymple. The thugs, faced with the quiet, collective will of the entire town, hesitated. They exchanged uncertain glances, muttered a few curses, and then, sullenly, they retreated. As they walked away, a new sound filled the air. The deep, resonant toll of the church bell began to ring out across the valley. It was not the call to Sunday service. It was not a fire alarm or a funeral dirge. The Reverend Michael was pulling the rope, his old face grim but resolute. It was a declaration. It was the sound of a town finding its voice. It was the sound of people choosing, at long last, not to be afraid. The 2 days granted by Judge Alden were a fragile truce, a pocket of quiet before a storm. The town of Red Hollow held its collective breath. Royce Dalrymple walked the streets with an air of untouchable arrogance. But for the first time, people did not step aside for him. They met his gaze with a flat, unblinking stillness. The balance of power had shifted, and the air crackled with it. Eliza knew that the hobnail and the rope were not enough. They were circumstantial, open to Royce's twisting interpretations. She needed something direct, something from the source. She found her opportunity in the network of women who were the town's invisible engine. Maria, whose husband worked as a teamster for the railroad, and Sarah, who took in the crew's laundry, were women who saw and heard everything. They, too, had suffered under Royce's petty tyranny's shorted payments, unwanted advances. When Eliza approached them, not with a plea, but with a quiet, determined plan, they agreed without hesitation. That night, under the sliver of a waning moon, 3 women slipped through the shadows toward the railroad camp. They carried empty laundry baskets, their approach cloaked in legitimacy. A sleepy guard at the gate barely glanced at them. Laundresses coming for the late-night collection were a common sight. Maria led them to the long, low-slung building that served as the tool warehouse, a place that smelled of grease, steel, and coal dust. The main door was locked with a heavy padlock, but Sarah knew of another way. A small delivery hatch at the back, used for passing out supplies, was secured only by a simple iron bar on the inside. A few minutes of patient work with a thin piece of wire, and the bar lifted with a soft click. Inside, the darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating black. Eliza struck a match and lit a torch. They had brought a thick bundle of oil-soaked rags wrapped around a stick. The flame blossomed, pushing the shadows back into the corners, revealing a cavernous space filled with the implements of an industrial war against the land. Coils of cable, stacks of sledgehammers, and barrels of blasting powder stood in silent, orderly rows, following a hunch. Eliza led them toward a section of the warehouse where barrels of oil were stored. Most were marked for use in the lamps and machinery, but in a dark corner, stacked behind a pile of spare rails, she found what she was looking for. 6 barrels, set apart from the others. The torchlight gleamed on the stenciled letters painted on their sides, R.D. Company, Reserve Supply. It was the company's private stock. She dipped a finger in a drip of thick liquid on the side of one barrel and brought it to her nose. Kerosene, strong and undiluted. The scent was a confirmation, a solid link in the chain she was forging. Nearby, a foreman's desk was pushed against the wall, covered in a disorderly pile of ledgers, manifests, and diagrams. While Maria and Sarah stood watch, their faces grim in the flickering torchlight, Eliza began to search. She moved with a methodical purpose, her hands sifting through the papers. She found shipping manifests for the hobnails, purchase orders for the kerosene, and then, tucked inside a heavy leather-bound logbook, she found it, a rolled-up engineering diagram of the valley's old irrigation system. She spread it out on the desk. The paper was old and brittle, but the lines drawn on it were new, in fresh, dark ink. Someone had sketched a modification, a crudely drawn but effective plan showing exactly where to block the channels to divert the entire flow of water directly onto the Merrick pasture. In the bottom right-hand corner of the diagram, in a small, arrogant script, were 2 initials, R.D. The ink was so fresh that it smeared slightly when she brushed it with her thumb. While Eliza was uncovering the plan, Judge Alden was enacting his own, bolstered by the town's newfound courage. He had brought the 2 captives from the church lockup to his small, cluttered office. He did not threaten them. He simply laid out the truth. "Royce Dalrymple will not protect you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "He will sacrifice you to save himself. The town saw the evidence. They know what happened. Your only hope is to tell the truth. Cooperate, and I will see that the court in the next county knows of it. Stay silent, and you will bear the full weight of this yourself." The 2 men exchanged a look of pure, animal fear. Their loyalty to Royce, a thing bought with a few silver dollars, evaporated under the heat of self-preservation. The man with the broken nose spoke first. It was the foreman, he mumbled, his voice thick with pain and defeat. "Foreman Royce. He paid us, said to make it look like a real cattle raid." Then the left-handed man, the one Eliza had disarmed, began to talk, the words spilling out in a torrent of confession. He described how Royce had given him the knife, a long, sharp blade from the warehouse. He described how Royce had pointed to a spot on an old map and told him exactly how to cut the weld tarp to maximize the water loss, to create the impression of a town in crisis, a land plagued by misfortune. It was everything the judge needed. He wrote out the search warrant by hand, his pen scratching furiously across the paper. He signed it with a flourish, his signature no longer the wavering scrawl of a frightened man, but the bold stroke of a magistrate upholding the law. The posse that assembled in the pre-dawn light was a strange one. Judge Alden, holding his warrant like a holy relic. Reverend Michael, his face set in lines of grim duty. Silas the blacksmith and 4 other grim-faced townsmen, deputized on the spot, carrying rifles and a heavy determination. and Cole Merrick, his face a mask of stone, his Winchester held loosely in his hands. They moved as a single body, their footsteps echoing in the quiet streets, their purpose a silent, powerful force. They found Royce at the warehouse, overseeing the morning loading of a supply wagon. He feigned surprise, then outrage, as Judge Alden presented him with the warrant. "This is an absurdity," Royce boomed, his voice echoing in the vast space. "You are trespassing on the property of the Transcontinental Railroad Company. I will have all of your jobs. This town will be wiped off the map. The law is the law. Mr. Dalrymple," the judge said, his voice shaking only slightly. "We have a warrant to search these premises for evidence connected to the recent acts of sabotage against this community." As the townsmen began to move through the warehouse, Royce's eyes fell on Cole, and his face twisted into a sneer of pure contempt. "You," he spat. "This is your doing, a desperate, failing rancher, trying to blame his own incompetence on his betters." It was at that moment that Eliza stepped out from behind a stack of crates, Maria and Sarah flanking her like a guard of honor. She held the rolled-up diagram in her hand. Royce's face went pale. He had not counted on her. He had not counted on the women. "It's over, Royce," Eliza said, her voice cutting through his bluster. She walked to a pile of new, neatly folded canvas tarps, identical to the one used on the well. Royce began to laugh, a harsh, grating sound. "And what is that supposed to prove, that I own tarps? This is a railroad. You foolish woman, not a dress shop." Eliza didn't answer him with words. She pulled a small sewing knife from her belt. With a quick, practiced movement, she slit the heavy stitches along the outer seam of the top tarp. It was a small, precise incision. She reached into the hem and pulled out a tiny, 2-inch square of scrap fabric that had been sewn inside. It was a maker's mark, a swatch used to identify the bolt of canvas. She then walked to the reserve supply barrels, dipped the swatch into the kerosene residue around the bunghole, and held it up for the judge to see. The swatch was stained with the same dark oil, and on the side of the barrel was a stenciled lot number, identifying the shipment. "Every bolt of canvas has a lot number," Eliza explained, her voice ringing with the authority of her craft. "That swatch proves this tarp came from the same shipment as the one on the well, and this kerosene, from your private reserve, matches the sample found on the rope used at the sluice gate. Your tools, your supplies, your plan." She unfurled the diagram. "And your signature." The evidence was a mountain. The diagram, the confessions, the hobnails, the kerosene, the perfectly matched swatch of canvas. It all came together, a net of his own making, pulling tight around him. Royce Dalrymple stood there, his face ashen, his mask of righteous indignation finally shattered, leaving only the ugly, avaricious man beneath. The railroad foreman, seeing the game was up, began to back away, disassociating themselves from their disgraced leader. Word would travel fast. The Transcontinental Railroad Company, ever mindful of its public image and federal contracts, would not tolerate such a scandal. The Red Hollow spur line would be suspended, its future in doubt. Judge Alden's verdict, delivered right there on the floor of the warehouse, was swift and final. He declared the act of God clause in Cole's deed to be null and void, a product of criminal conspiracy. He levied a fine against Royce Dalrymple so heavy it would cripple him, the money to be used to repair the damage to the town's well and Cole's land. And he granted Cole a 5-year interest-free extension on his mortgage, giving him the breathing room he so desperately needed. As the deputies led Royce away, a broken, defeated man, a great, collective sigh seemed to pass through the assembled townsfolk. It was over. The weight that had been pressing down on all of them had finally been lifted. Eliza felt it most of all. A wave of profound relief washed over her, so powerful it made her knees feel weak. The tension she had been holding inside for weeks, the constant vigilance, the fear, it all drained away in a single, sudden rush. Her head felt light. Without thinking, she swayed slightly, and her head came to rest against Cole's chest. It was not a calculated move, not a gesture for an audience. It was the simple, involuntary act of a body seeking a solid place to rest. He reacted instinctively. His arm came around her, his hand settling gently on her back. He began to pull her into a full embrace, a gesture of comfort and shared victory. But then he stopped. He felt, more than saw, a change in her. He looked down and saw that her eyes were closed, and a small, slow smile was spreading across her face. It was not a smile for him. It was a smile of pure, personal triumph. It was the quiet, deeply satisfied smile of a woman who had fought her own battle, with her own tools, and had won. He understood. She was not leaning on him for support. She was simply resting in the harbor of their shared victory. He slowly let his arm drop, his hand brushing hers for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of her strength. Outside, the sun was fully risen, bathing the valley in a clean, golden light. The engine of the supply train stood silent on the tracks, its firebox cold. The loud, brutal sounds of industry had ceased. In their place, the only sound was the gentle, rhythmic chirping of the crickets in the tall grass, a sound like 1,000 tiny needles, patiently stitching the quiet, wounded heart of the night back together again. A strange, new quiet settled over Red Hollow. It was not the tense, watchful silence of before, but a stillness born of relief, like the calm that follows a breaking fever. The salt wind still blew, but it seemed to have lost its angry, scouring edge. It was just wind now, moving the dust from one place to another. Royce Dalrymple, stripped of his power and facing a mountain of fines, began selling off his land holdings at a fraction of their worth. He was a ghost at his own funeral, his presence in the town a fading stain. With his influence gone, the town itself seemed to exhale. The saloon music, for the first time anyone could remember, was played at a volume that allowed for conversation. People met each other's eyes in the street. The air was still thin and dry, but it was easier to breathe. The weekly stagecoach, which usually brought little more than mail-order catalogs and news of the outside world, delivered a thick, formal-looking envelope to the dressmaker's shop. It was addressed to Miss Eliza Hart, Mrs. Gable brought it up to her room with a look of undisguised curiosity. The letter was from a town called Santa Vespera, a prosperous coastal community 200 miles to the west. The letterhead was embossed, the paper thick and clean. It was from a consortium of shipping merchants. They had heard of her skill word of the woman who had faced down the railroad and won, had traveled faster than the stagecoach, and they were making her an offer. They wanted her to establish and run a new canvas and sail-making workshop. The terms were spelled out in clear, elegant script, a generous monthly salary, a clean, spacious workshop overlooking the harbor, and a 2-room apartment above it. There would be no dust, no mud, no feuds. Just good, clean work, fair pay, and the respectable life of a valued artisan. Eliza read the letter 3 times. She sat by her window, the heavy paper resting in her lap, and looked out at the dusty main street of Red Hollow, Santa Vespera. She could almost smell the salt air, a different kind of salt from the biting grit she knew here. She could picture the clean workshop, the organized rows of tools, the steady, respectable work. It was an escape. It was an honorable discharge from a long and difficult war. It was everything a sensible woman should want. She looked down at her hands. They were not the hands of a lady. The palms were calloused, the skin cross-hatched with 100 tiny, silvery scars from slipped needles and sharp awls. A new blister was forming on her thumb from the heavy work of repairing the town's damaged tarps. These were the hands that had earned her a place in this hard, unforgiving valley. They were the physical record of her fight for independence. The offer from Santa Vespera promised to make them soft again. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Her mind drifted to the sounds of the Red Hollow night, the low, contented breathing of cattle, the lonely cry of a coyote on a distant ridge, the metallic rattle of her window frame in the wind, the steady, rhythmic hiss of her own needle pulling thread through thick canvas in the quiet lamplight. These were the sounds that had become the backdrop to her life, the music of her hard-won freedom. She had come here with nothing, expecting nothing. She had not intended to put down roots. But the fight, the shared struggle, had woven her into the fabric of this place in a way she had never anticipated. A few days later, Cole came to her. He had been giving her space, a quiet, respectful distance since she had received the letter. He knew what it represented. He came to her not at her small room, but found her by the creek, where she was washing a piece of canvas. He was carrying something in his hands. It was a single, thick plank of weathered pine, about 2 feet long. It was old, but the wood was sound. He had spent hours sanding it smooth, removing the splinters but leaving the deep, honest grain of the wood. And into its surface, he had carefully burned a series of letters. He didn't say a word. He simply held it out to her. She wiped her wet hands on her trousers and took it from him. The wood was warm from the sun and the work of his hands. She read the words. Hart Merrick Wind Tarp Works. She traced the letters with her finger. H-A-R-T. Her name came first. It wasn't an afterthought. It was the foundation. And then Merrick, not Mrs. Merrick's Sewing Emporium. Not the Merrick Ranch, with assistance from Miss Hart. It was a partnership, an alliance of 2 names, standing side by side, equal in weight and measure. He wasn't offering her a place in his home. He was offering her a place in his work, in his future. This was his proposal, written not in flowery prose, but burned into a piece of solid, unadorned wood. It was the most honest and profound declaration she had ever received. She looked up from the sign, her dark eyes searching his. She saw the fear there, the raw vulnerability of a man who had put his entire future into her hands. But she also saw a deep, abiding respect. He was not trying to own her or save her. He was asking her to stand with him. I will stay, she said, her voice quiet but firm as the wood she held. On 2 conditions. He waited, his face tense. First, this is a partnership on paper, a legal agreement. I own a share of the business, and I have a say in every decision. She met his gaze, her own unwavering. That means we will argue. Like owners, not like a husband and wife. A flicker of a smile touched Cole's lips, a release of the tension he had been holding for days. Deal, he said. The single word, a solemn vow. And second, she said, we build it together. They did not seal their bargain with a handshake or an embrace. They sealed it with work. The next morning, they began construction on a new, open-sided workshop, a lean-to built against the long sound wall of the new barn. The sounds of their labor became the new music of the ranch, the rhythmic rasp of a handsaw cutting through timber, the sharp, clean report of a hammer driving nails. They worked together with an easy, unspoken synchronicity, as if they had been partners for years. He would lift a heavy beam into place, and she would be there to brace it. She would mark a line for a cut, and his saw would follow it with perfect precision. They were a team, their individual strengths combining into a single, efficient force. They built a new, larger roof over the holding pen, a great, sloping canopy of fresh pine and newly stitched canvas. That night, the calves, safe and dry, slept peacefully under the new shelter. The straight, even seam of the tarp they had stitched together ran down the center of the roof, a perfect, unwavering line against the darkening sky. It was a line of order, a testament to the future they were building with their own 2 hands. A week later, they rode into town together. Their destination was not the church, but the small, cramped office where Judge Alden conducted the town's legal affairs. They had asked Reverend Michael to join them. They spread the partnership agreement out on the judge's cluttered desk. It was a simple document, drafted by Eliza in her clear, strong script, and reviewed by Cole. It laid out the terms of their business, the division of labor, the sharing of profits, the ownership of the land and the tools. It was a document of equals. The Reverend read it carefully, his old eyes moving slowly over the words. He nodded, a deep satisfaction on his face. This is a good and just agreement, he said, and he signed his name at the bottom as the official witness. Then Judge Alden, his face serious, took his official stamp, pressed it onto the ink pad, and brought it down on the paper with a solid, satisfying thud. The official seal of the Red Hollow Township was now embossed on their future. The ink on the paper was dark and final, drying as quickly as the morning sun burns the dew off the grass. It was a contract with no hidden clauses, no secrets lurking in the fine print. Just as Cole was reaching for the pen to sign his name, Eliza placed her hand on his arm. "One more thing," she said. She took the pen and at the bottom of the page added one final clause. Her script was neat and precise. "It is further agreed," she wrote, "that one evening per week, from the ringing of the supper bell until the following dawn, all work shall cease. This time shall not be the property of the business, nor of either partner. This time is to be freely chosen, without obligation." She had created a space for them, a sanctuary in time, not just in place. A weekly promise that they were more than just business partners, but that their connection would not be a matter of ownership or duty. It would be a choice, renewed each week. She pushed the document and the pen to Cole. He read the new clause, and then he looked at her. He understood its meaning completely. It was the most profound promise of all. He picked up the pen. His hand was steady, his signature strong and clear. As he finished, he looked up at her, and she saw that his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. He did not look away. He did not try to hide them. They were the honest, open expression of a man who, after a lifetime of loss and solitude, had finally found a partner to stand beside. Not behind, a man who had learned that true strength was not in standing alone, but in having the courage to lean and be leaned upon, in equal measure. The afternoon bell from the white chapel rolled across the valley, a slow, gentle sound that measured the day's peaceful decline. It was not a call to prayer, but a simple marking of time. A new tradition started by the Reverend to remind the townsfolk that one day was ending and another would soon begin. A steady rhythm to replace the frantic beat of fear they had lived with for so long. Down in the pasture, the new calves, their coats thick and healthy, grazed on the recovering grass. The large canvas shelter, the first official product of Hartmerick Wind Tarp Works, stood strong and true, its seams casting straight, clean shadows in the soft breeze. The edge of the new tarp fluttered gently, like the open page of a letter waiting to be read. The sign, the plank of weathered pine, hung from a post at the entrance to the ranch lane. Hartmerick. The letters were burned deep and clear. The salt wind, making its daily journey through the valley, passed over it. But the words were indelible. The wind could not erase them. It could not whisper them away. They were a fact, as solid and real as the ground they were built on. The work for the day was almost done. They stood near the new workshop, a space that smelled of fresh sawn pine, curing leather, and Eliza's waterproofing wax. The setting sun slanted across the hills, turning the dust motes in the air into a shimmering golden haze. It was a quiet, domestic kind of light, a light that softened the hard edges of the land. Eliza held something out to him in the palm of her hand. It was a small, folded piece of cloth, clean and white. Cole recognized it immediately. It was the strip of fabric he had torn from his own sleeve to bandage her wrist on the night of the flood, after she had worked for hours repairing the well tarp. He had forgotten about it completely. She had washed it, and on its surface, in a neat, strong line of dark blue thread, she had embroidered 2 words. The stitches were tiny, perfect, and as uncompromising as the woman who had made them, not fragile. He took the small piece of cloth from her. It felt weightless in his calloused hand. He looked from the words to her face. A slow smile spread across his lips, a genuine expression of warmth that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. It was a smile she was only just beginning to get used to. "No," he said, his voice a low, soft rumble. "You are not." He looked down at the words again, then back at her, his smile fading into something more serious, more vulnerable. "But I'm not made of stone, either." It was a confession, an admission of his own weariness, his own wounds, the cracks in the solitary fortress he had built around himself for so long. It was an offering, a piece of his own truth to match hers. Eliza's gaze softened. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then I suppose we'll have to lean on each other when the need arises." It was an invitation, a statement of terms, not of dependence, but of mutual support. A partnership that extended beyond the legal document locked in the judge's office. Cole took a step closer. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to step back, to refuse. He did not want to startle her. He did not want to presume. He reached for her, his large, work-roughened hands settling gently on her shoulders. He drew her toward him, a slow, steady pull, until she was standing so close that the space between them was filled with the warmth of their bodies. He drew her in until she could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her own chest. It was a strong, reassuring sound, the beat of a life that was no longer running, no longer fighting alone. She did not resist. She did not stiffen. She let him bring her in. Then, in a gesture that was all her own, she lifted her hand and laid it flat against the center of his chest, her palm resting over the source of that steady beat, and she leaned into him. She rested her head against his shoulder, a quiet, voluntary surrender to the moment. It was not the desperate clutch of a damsel in distress, but the conscious, trusting lean of a partner. The sun dipped lower, pouring its last golden light over the scene. It gilded the stray hairs that had escaped her tightly bound braid and illuminated the fine lines of exhaustion and strength around his eyes. There was no audience. There were no gossips on a porch, no smirking faces in a saloon. There was only the gentle evening air, the low, contented breathing of the calves in their pen, and the two of them, standing together in a circle of hard-won peace. He lowered his head, and she tilted her face up to meet him. Their lips met. The kiss was not born of a sudden, fiery passion. It was quiet, sure, and solid. It was short, a simple pressing of mouths, a taste of salt and dust and sun. It was a seal on a contract, a confirmation of a truth that no longer needed words. It was a promise of the 1,000 ordinary days that would follow. When the kiss ended, they did not linger in a long, romantic gaze. They simply stepped apart, the space between them no longer a divide, but a comfortable, shared territory. They turned, side by side, and looked at the work that still remained. The day was not over. The life they were building was not a fairy tale that ended with a kiss. It was a working ranch. There were still 3 canvas tarps to be waterproofed before the morning dew. A saddle with a broken stirrup leather lay waiting on Eliza's workbench, and in the pen, the new spring calves needed to be marked with the simple, clean brand of the Merrick Ranch, a mark of ownership, of belonging, of a future that had been pulled back from the brink. They turned back to their work, moving with the easy, familiar rhythm of partners who knew their tasks and knew they could count on the person standing beside them. In the town of Red Hollow, the stories began to change. The old whispers about the brooding, unlucky rancher and the strange, defiant woman from out of nowhere faded like mist in the morning sun. A new story took their place. It was told not in the saloons, but over fence lines and on the porch of the general store. It was a quieter, truer story. It was the story of a woman who was not fragile, and of a man who had finally learned how to lean without crushing. It was the story of a partnership forged in fire and flood, and sealed with the quiet integrity of a well-stitched seam. The season of the salt wind passed, giving way to the gentle rains of autumn and the deep, quiet cold of winter. And through it all, Eliza Hart and Cole Merrick stayed. They chose each other every morning, with the rising of the sun and the first chores of the day. They chose each other with every shared meal, every difficult decision, every quiet moment of exhaustion at a day's end. Their life together was not an epic romance, but something stronger, more enduring. It was like the final, locking stitch on a piece of heavy canvas, a small, deliberate act of pulling 2 separate edges together to make a single, solid whole, built to withstand the wind. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. To hear more tales from the frontier, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Wild West Stories 1850 and like this video. And if you'd like to give this story an extra boost, please consider hitting the hype button to help it reach more listeners just like you.